Joseph Tribble, M.Div, is Instructor of Religious Studies and Student Life Director at ABC. He holds a BA from Fisk University and an M.Div from Vanderbilt Divinity School. And Phyllis Hildreth, J.D., is Director of Grants Management and Strategic Partnership at American Baptist College and serves as faculty for Lipscomb University's College of Leadership and Public Service. She holds a BA in Biology from Harvard University, a JD from University of Maryland School of Law, and an MA in Conflict Management from Lipscomb University. So we'll begin with their responses, and then when they are finished, Jane will pass the mic to you as our moderator for you to offer your comments and questions. Who would like to go first?
Thank you. I will volunteer because I think that the theologian to my right should close us out and get us back to a good place because I don't know where I'm going to take us. It is a pleasure to be here with you. I am Phyllis Hildreth. I'm relatively new to American Baptist College. I came here at the first of this year after a 6-year stint at Lipscomb University, first as a student in that master's program, and almost immediately upon graduation became an instructor and the academic director. So my lens on this and my disclaimer first off is I am not a theologian. I am not a historian. I am not trained as a critical race scholar. I am not trained as an anthropologist nor a sociologist. However, all of those personages, all of those disciplines, all of those lines of intellectual thought are clearly implicated by our task today, which is to sit and try to think together and learn together, if you will, about what we're understanding mimetic theory. You understand that far better than I. How that may sit with beloved community, probably closer to my native tongue, if you will. And where are the overlaps and the opportunities and where are the tensions? So being a public defender, I have some inclinations. I feel that I'm growing out of them, but nevertheless they are there to fuss and fight, right? And this becomes even more if you know about my family. My daughter is a JAG officer in the United States Army stationed in Korea right now, and she is an attorney. So if you really want to see fun, have two attorneys cooking together, making spaghetti and fussing. So, you know, there's a little bit of that pugnaciousness that comes out, and this default of show me the evidence. Why is that? Why do you say that is true? So as I come, and this is not completely my first exposure to mimetic theory, my former dean at Lipscomb and still current friend and colleague in this field, Steve Joyner, specializes in first congregational care, conflict management, systems theory, and he introduced me to Gerard's book on scapegoating pretty much at the beginning of my tenure of that particular study. But what was fascinating to me is that's about the only time we have that conversation and connection. This theory does not show up in the newly forming canon of conflict management. We're a very young field. You know, my first field is 5,000 years old, the law. Conflict management, not so much, maybe 40, 50 years. Particularly, we think about, obviously there were international peace studies that come to the fore in the immediate aftermath of World War II. So you have 70, 80 years there. And in those intervening years, you had thinkers thinking about how people think and decide. So you have the mathematicians starting to bring game theory into it. You had the psychologists starting to think about and ask questions. How do people think and decide under uncertainty? So you have the work of Tversky and Kahneman. Kahneman received the 2002 Nobel in economics for thinking under uncertainty. And that whole field of heuristics, mental shortcuts, which get to prejudice and biases, etc. So there's a way in which all of those folks, and then my field, the law, got into this actually in the mid-70s when some of the things we've talked about happened. there was explosion in the county and city courthouses around the country. The dockets were off the chain. Why? Two things happened at the same time. First of all, the first war against drug, prosecuted by President Nixon, increased the criminalization and therefore the number of persons who were prosecuted and brought into the judicial system who needed their speedy trials guaranteed by the Sixth Amendment. Amen? Mm-hmm. At the same time, science kind of discovered chemical contraception, which completely did a number on the way in which our culture looked at love, sex, etc. And that led to the wholesale change in our attitudes towards divorce. So now you didn't just have folks maybe running away to Mexico or Las Vegas or Atlantic City. Everybody in all 50 states now want to get no-fault divorces. Those two things jammed up the courts. And there was this period in the beginning of the 80s where in Los Angeles County, one could wait 5 years. If you hear my former president tell this story, he says you can get in a car accident, finish your undergraduate degree, go to law school, complete it, get your bar license, and then come and just be in time to represent yourself in the case that happened 5 years ago. And so this sort of move to conflict alternative dispute resolution, mediation, not for the good of reconciling us as we went. It was like, y'all fix that and get it out of this courthouse so we can finish prosecuting the black and brown people we want to sweep up for drugs and put them in jail because we can't negotiate away the criminal cases. Does that make sense? So with that background, I have all of these disciplines feeding into a field that we call conflict management, conflict resolution, alternative dispute resolution, peace studies, get the Mennonites in there. So we're a little bit of everybody. And so I've spent my last 5 years trying to thread the needle and think critically about who are the thinkers, what are the thoughts, what is the context for their position, and how do these line up together. So good practice to come and receive this generous invitation to speak with you and think together with you in community. And so you can see where my rubric is going. Who is this thinker? France, 1927. Really worried about Nazis. France kind of has a colonial history, a tortured colonial history. France has a whole lot of unhealed stuff with their racism, very different than our 400 years, but it is there nonetheless. And in doing a little more preparation for today, I found out that so much so that after World War II, when de Gaulle comes in and says we are one France and we only have that sort of we don't see race, actually manifested itself as there was no reference to black folks. When they were called blacks, they were called the Les Blacks in English. And there's a current movement now to sort of go back in. You can't have truth and reconciliation without truth, to tell the truth. And so the current movement in France right now is for folks of the African diaspora to reclaim their noirness. So the French word for black, we are noir, we are here, see us. But that's only recent, that's right now. And that's way before Girard formed and framed his lens. So I wonder a little bit about that, okay? We all have our limitations. I have my limitations. I see the world as a black woman in America. Now, I do not speak for all black women in America, but my particular experiences are true, and they do filter in color. And so what we do to overcome that is, as he alluded to this morning, one of the areas of work that we are engaged in right now is that civic engagement. How do we work with conflict in civic spaces? Beloved community, Martin Luther King Jr. 50 years later. And the theorists that I would commend to you are Chris Benner and Manuel Pastor. And they have written recently, in the last 2 years, a fascinating, scholarly but practical book about equity and growth in community. And one of the things that is so revolutionary is that they bypass the paywall of the Academy's publishing system and went straight online, so that if you go look this up now, you can actually download the entire book. If you're old school analog like me and you still need to read the copy, you can buy that too. But if you want to get started, you can do this. And what their central thesis is, they looked at 5 or 6 communities around the country and ways in which these communities have interrogated and engaged equity and inequity, and start to overcome that to have sustained growth in their communities. From Charlottesville, San Antonio, Fresno, California, just around the country, they found this one unifying theme, that those communities that found a way to think together, to bring everybody to the deliberative spaces, the thinking spaces, the decision-making spaces, across culture, across class, as was mentioned earlier, that those are epistemic communities, meaning we are learning together what it is to know and what can be known. Their tagline is, it's not what you know, it's who you know it with. It's not what you know, it's who you know it with. So one of the questions that I have for us, and this is the long arc question, is who is knowing mimetic theory together? Okay? So if this comes from the anthropologists, well, what anthropologists? Just the white ones at Hopkins and Duke, etc.? Are we looking at the anthropology strictly from an Anglo-Eurocentric lens? I wonder about that. The sociologist mentioned Durkheim and religion. Well, there are a lot of sociologists of color working right now. And I told you I'm not trained in that, but I try to self-study because I know that that's important, just so I can know what questions to ask and with whom I need to listen, right? And so I am understanding that the 21st century post-Michael Brown sociologists are talking about what's happening in the global south. What is the lens from the global south? So you're picking up Africa in that definition. You're picking up the southern hemisphere, right? Who are those thinkers? And are they thinking, responding to and publishing about mimetic theory? Are they pushing back with their lens? It's one thing for me to sit in the pew as a layperson and say, that'll make no sense to me. But that's my lay opinion. And I will tell you, as a professional conflict manager, one of the things we try to do is help persons distinguish from personal opinion and informed fact so that we can move to spaces of agency and efficacy, right? And so it's not enough for me to question, I don't trust this because I don't know who's saying it. I want to ask the question, who else is there? So who else is in the field? Who else is talking about it? As we turn to the back of the scholarly tome and look at the references, we might be able to pick out gender, but we can't necessarily pick out race or cultural origin, right? So it becomes very much important for those of you engaged in this work to actually send up a flare and highlight and say, hey, did you check out what this Pakistani person said about this? Are you looking at what this Nigerian scholar is saying about it? And then come back and bring this, because as we're thinking together, we can have some mutual assurance of comfort. Then one of the last places I want to go before I hand it over to my colleague and then we come back together and entertain your questions is this. I am very interested, personally, professionally, spiritually, in thinking about the differences between a scientific frame and a metaphoric frame. I believe I was actually just after giving all these, I'm not of this, I'm not of that, I was the Women's Day speaker at my church this past Sunday. And as I told them to kind of stand in that lectern on Pentecost and Women's Day, which are two just so very important, powerful, don't even know what to do with that. But we talk about, my brain just fled. Sorry, I'll find back. And I'm sorry, I'm also caring for a father who is ill and not getting some sleep right now. So the brain is going in and out. Stories. Talked about stories being our strength. And we were trying to understand Luke and the story of the woman with the issue of blood. And it sounds like she just showed up out of nowhere, kind of photobombed Jesus, reached out, touched his gland, got what she needed, ran on back home. And on Women's Day, we were saying, wait a minute, we as women know. We as women don't roll that way. If she had that problem for 12 years, she and her girlfriends in the market, while they were making whatever it is they sell, while they were talking, and that was probably some group consensus thinking, right? Crowdsourcing of wisdom, of, hey, we heard there's this guy. Why don't you go check it out? And then once she was healed, do you believe that the end of the pericope is the end of the story? No. We women know that she went back and told the women and said, yeah, girl, he's there, he's available, we need to get on this. So she did her gospel outreach, right? But we had to use our sense of story to overcome that imagination. I believe that there's a place, a holy place, a true place for stories that tell a truth and love. And that is okay. The facts aren't right. As long as the love and the truth is okay, it's fine, right? Now, change hats. You heard the beginning of my background. I do have a BA in biology. I am the child of a chemist. I married an immunologist. I spent my first 5 years following my true love around the world with a pipette in hand doing lab science for him, all right? So there's a little bit of science stuff in here. I actually take the science as seriously as I take the integrity of my legal field, as I take the integrity of the theology that those who are better versed to do. So I am very uncomfortable with playing fast and loose with science. From a justice standpoint, I am uncomfortable with that, because if we're not careful, we get things like the bell curve that prove that I'm not as smart as the rest of you all because the science said so, right? And that lie walks abroad and does its damage for a quarter century until somebody retracts it way in the back of the journal on page 57 and said, oops, my bad, actually, nah, no difference, right? So saying that, I want to ask questions of caution around the neuroscience, the neurobiology, the mirror neurons, because I looked that up before I came in as well. And another name I commend to you, Robert Sapolsky, a brilliant neuroscientist, neurobiologist at Stanford, where I understand Gerard was. And so that's one of the reasons I looked for it. Published recently in the last 2 years a book entitled Behave. And you can find, he's a brilliant communicator. Now the book is 500 pages long, but you can find YouTube lectures of him that are manageable and listen to him. So he talks about this. And the more recent science actually steps back from mirror neurons a little bit. So I'm concerned about the science of mimetics, but the metaphor and mystery of the story does make a lot of sense. Does that make sense? So where I will take this in closing is we're going to hit the science and leave it and come back over to where I think we move into the theology, is to look at the stories. Who do we want to imitate? Oh, and I just said we. That's my last caution on this. Check carefully who the we is. When Gerard says we, when we say we, and I actually heard Paul say we, we need the women of color. And I'm going, really? I am your colleague in thinking about all this together. But for you to stand in center and say, we need us to come tell you, is fraught with difficulties on so many levels, right? Because it still centers the primacy of this view. It says this view is central. It confesses it may be deficient. And therefore, if we would come in from the margins and clean it up a little bit, the cleaning woman, and then go back and sit down on the fringes, it'll be shiny and new. Perhaps it is more of, what do the 3 of us, what do the 50 of us? Who else is, the last questions I always ask my students in conflict management to ask is, once they think we have a deal and we have it reconciled, then ask, who else needs to be at this table? From who else have we not heard? What other perspective am I missing? When somebody tells me that was great, I then turn around and say, yeah, what did I get wrong? Because that's something we always have to do. So minding the we, once we kind of get the we fixed, then where we, I think, do all sit as a body of believers, how do we want to be like Jesus? This morning, in doing my daily devotions, my Bible by the year, that I read in cycles, some years I read it all the way through, and 10 years go by, I don't. I picked it up recently as a discipline again. It turns out that today, the gospel reading is from John, the 12th chapter, 20 through 50th verse. And Jesus was basically preparing folks, saying, I'm getting ready to go. But if I don't die and then come back up, the other kernels don't come. And it's lengthy, and I can't point to the money quote for you right now. You can go back and look at it. But what hit me is there was this whole thing where he was inviting by example, be like me, which sounds like mimetics. So if the we are the bodies of believers, and we want to be like Jesus, then notwithstanding all of the speed bumps I have with your theory going on, it looks like we still end up in the same place with beloved community, which is, how do we, because there is one money quote saying, those who love their lives in this world will lose it, and those who care nothing about their lives in this world will keep it for eternity. Isn't that the opposite of desire? Being like Jesus means saying, I lay it down. You can have it. I don't care anything about it. And that is the only way that this ends up being nonviolent. Because from conflict management theory, changing somebody's identity, taking somebody's identity, forcing them to be in the world another way is actually one of the most violent things we can do. And I don't need sticks and stones, but if I tell you that you have been privileged and you have way too much money and you need to give up the land that you stole from the Indians before the genocide, before the theft of our ancestors' bodies, and the discounted theft of the other immigrants who come in, so that you have been accruing capital with compounding interest over 400 years and then got the nerve to look at me and say, I'm not handling my money right? Now, if I tell you that the real problem is the 500 years is systemic, not the individual, you're a good person, but you benefited from a racist society. Therefore, you got to give all that stuff up now. Where's my money? I think that you're going to perceive that that's a little bit violent. If I demand it from you, it's violent. But I think what Jesus said here in the 10th chapter of John is that if I offer it, that's the only way in which this reset button is not violent. So the challenge for each of us, where we sit in this story, is to talk about, what do I have? What was perhaps I don't deserve to have, and what do I need to give back? And that is not a symmetrical conversation. Thank you.
God bless you, brother.
Right, I am rethinking this whole thing, and as she was finishing up and talking about really my interpretation of that is the notion of reparations, and I'm thinking about the story of Zacchaeus and how Zacchaeus as a tax collector spent his life collecting monies from people and doing so in many instances unjustly. And just sitting back and essentially reaping the benefits of a system of which he was a part of, right? And after meeting Jesus, saying, hold on, I have to now recalibrate my desire, right? And it's the same thing that Jesus calls the young rich ruler to do, right? In giving up his position of power, his wealth, and even the ability to continue to accumulate those things just simply by being in position. And so with both of those persons, what they essentially have to give up is the position of privilege, right? Which is a word that came out earlier today as we were talking through, Paul was talking through racism and what racism is. And so for me, where I kind of want to center my comments is around the notion of desire. That's kind of what stuck out to me initially, and as he was going through the three tenets, this really is my first introduction to mimetic theory, and so I'm very glad to be here with each one of you on today and for this week. But as I understand it, mimetic desire, right, is mimicking desire, right? This desire that we learn how, what, and whom, right? Where do we learn that from, right? We're learning it from others. We're learning from mother, we're learning from father, brothers, sisters, such and so forth. What comes into the picture is the idea of rivalry. However, I want to kind of switch that because I don't know if mimicking desire is always about rivalry, right? Sometimes mimicking desire is also then about the creation, and that the only thing of which we can mimic is that which has been patterned before us to begin with. Right? I think part of what I witnessed and as I was thinking is that we may have put the egg before the chicken, so to speak, right? In that, as we're talking about culture, we're talking about culture after the fact. It seems rather to me that culture actually comes before desire, right? Because culture is how we learn what, whom, and when, and such and so forth to desire, okay? We learn this from even in what's taking place in our homes, and then that which is marketed to us. Now, the word and covetousness, right, is innate. So we do see, someone else playing with something and say, oh, I want that. But how do we know that that is something to be desired? Okay. And once we learn that, not only individually, but collectively, now we have begun to set up standards. Standards of beauty, standards of wealth, standards of power, and as those various standards are set up, that is what ultimately become our objects of desire, our subjects also of desire. This, in my mind, says, okay, if I have a standard, the opposite of that standard is going to be the scapegoat. Okay, now how does this ultimately end up playing out in society? Well, ultimately that ends up playing out in society in that I am the embodied scapegoat, right? I am a black male, right? I, at one point in history, would have been automatically assumed to be a chattel slave. Then from there, as was mentioned, I became known as automatically as a criminal, right? Being here on the campus of American Baptist College is probably, and a few other, hotspots, one of the few places I can go in Nashville And I do not in some way, shape, form, or fashion become an outsider. Now, mind you, I've been in Nashville for 25, almost 26 years. Just to give you a little story, I like to tell stories. When I was at Vanderbilt, you heard, I went to Vanderbilt, did a master's degree there. And while I was there, I'm a relatively big guy. I was in better shape than I am now, right? I got married a few years ago. Y'all know how that goes. I put on a couple of pounds, had a child, and all that kind of stuff. But I was in better shape. I was younger. I was more fit. The question that I would get constantly and consistently was, hold on, come on, because you already know it. I saw you mouthing. What was it?
You're a football player.
There you go. Are you a football player?
And if you've been taller.
Right, and if I had been taller, I would have been a basketball player. Right? Because it was not conceivable to the, and I'm going to use this word purposefully, ordinary population that I was there on scholarship because of my mind. I had to have been there to, in some way, shape, form, or fashion, entertain and or benefit the general populace. Okay, and so these are what our standards are. In this moment, I become the scapegoat. I become one to whom a particular projection can be put upon. Okay, and I become that scapegoat. Now, as we're talking about racism, and I'm trying to work this thing together. Like I said, it's my first time hearing it. This notion, this black and white dynamic, right? I want us to also think about the history and the construction of race to begin with, right? Because if mimetic theory holds true, and at least in what I can see in terms of the notion of we learn how to desire from others, this notion of desire, I think there's a lot of truth to that, right? But I also think that St. Augustine probably had something good to say about desire, and that all that which we desire is evil, right? And then obviously taking that which St. Paul has to say in terms of saying that I must crucify my flesh daily, right? Those things that I desire, I must lay those things to the wayside in order to be a follower of Jesus. But the construction of race, right? The construction of race essentially set up a binary, and it put one group in a position of power over and against another group. However, even as we think about whiteness, and I heard, whiteness mentioned a few times of what white is, whiteness only exists in the presence of blackness. Okay? It does not exist otherwise. White people were not white people until they came to America. They were French, and as he mentioned, they were British, right? They were German. They were Spaniards, right? They were all these different collections of people who had their own rivalries and differences, and they knew their distinctiveness between one another. And then somewhere in about the 1700s, late 1600s, as the colonies are formed, Virginia, Maryland, and some of the other ones up and down the eastern seaboard, as they imported black indentured servants, white people decided, hold on, we're white and they're black. And why? Really simple. The notion of race is very simple. It's beneficial for us to be able to distinguish between you and us. Right? And by doing so, we can do so profitably. Okay, in this profit, right, we are now creating then the object, right, of desire. We are creating standards of beauty. We are creating standards of power. We are creating standards of wealth. And we are also perhaps even without knowing it, creating, to use this language, the scapegoat. Okay? The scapegoat that we can now blame for all of the very ills of society, even as our standards are only our standards in opposition to your scapegoat. Without the scapegoat, the standard does not exist. It's not possible for it to exist because there must be an opposite, there must be a binary, at least in my estimation. Okay. Now, as I'm taking these and I go, okay, so we've got race, we've got this desire that is all put together. Now, what do we do with that now? And what does then if the deconstruction of racism look like? Right? Yes, it is the acknowledgement of power, but it is also then perhaps even the acknowledgement of distinctiveness without separation and without opposition. Right? I don't think that the solution to think biblically is Galatians, where Paul says, and we know in Christ Jesus that there is no Jew, no Greek, no male, no female, for all are one in Christ Jesus. I don't think that's the solution here, right? Because the collapsing of these binaries simply takes away my identity and to reference that Dr. Hildreth just mentioned in terms of France, and now you have black French people reclaiming their own black Frenchness, if you will, and calling themselves noir, and seeing, okay, there's a problematic in collapsing ourselves into this other that has for many centuries already defined us. Right? So we're not talking about the collapsing of one into the other. That's not possible, but it is also another form of what I would like to call nonviolent violence, right? Wherein we're not using guns, we're not using knives, we're not using crucifixion or any of those other methods that we think of as being violent, but we are committing a certain violence to the human spirit and soul, right? And that's what, if you will, I believe it was either the IRS or IRO actually creates, is it perpetuates a certain kind of violence, well, both of them actually perpetuates a certain kind of violence to the soul in which the individual subjects themselves to an inferior state that has already been assigned to them by, right, the standards of objectification. And so I don't think our solution is to think through this thing and the collapse of racism. It's not Galatians, but rather I find some sense of hope in Revelation. Right? In Revelation, John the Revelator, he says, and I looked, and I looked out, and there was a number that no man could count. People of all nations from everywhere. And the beauty of that Revelation passage is that it acknowledges that there, and even to talk about Pentecost and the New Testament narrative, is that it acknowledges the difference between people. And I think that God does that. Right? God acknowledges the differences between us culturally, whether we're talking about our gender, or familially, or whatever the different kind of differences that there are. God acknowledges those. And it is in those differences, as we're talking about the beloved community, that the beloved community can be found, right? In acknowledging and being able to cross-pollinate in and through conversation and listening to each other in our own tongues, right? Because that's the other piece about Revelation as well as Pentecost, is that, okay, as John looks out and he sees people of all different nations who have now come a number that no man can count, and then we look at that conversation with Pentecost. Well, Pentecost, they look out and they say, well, what's happening? And each one heard what was being said in his own language, right? And as we know, from language to language, there's some stuff that does not translate, right? And even as we talk about, the human experience, and this is the danger of collapsing things into these large categories, and why we should not. As we know, there's some things that don't translate from one language to another. The example I always give to my students when talking about this is they're all familiar with, agape love, and everybody's familiar with eros love. And everybody's familiar with filial love, right? And then there's storge love. So in Greek, there's like 4 different ways to say love. We only have one way to say love in English. Like, I love you. Well, which way do you mean? Right? Do you mean you love me like a brother, like a friend? Are you in love with me as this romantic love? We only have one way to say love in English, right? Well, if that holds true in language, it also holds true in terms of people and their distinctiveness and our own distinctiveness culturally. Right? There's some stuff that does not translate from me being black to you being white. But it doesn't mean we don't have a conversation. Right? Because on my phone there's a little Google Translate app, and I can talk with someone in Spanish, and we have difficulty. The ladies around there that claim they all speak Spanish, and we have great difficulty conversing with each other. But we still try. Right? And that's what the beloved community, at least in my estimation, is about, is the attempt at a conversation. And so to rope in, once again, what Dr. Hildreth was saying in terms of, yes, okay, so what and who else are a part of this, is a part of this conversation, right? Who are the people that we're reading? Who are the people that are contributing to what and how, not only we think about Mimetic theory, but also about racism, but not just about racism, but even the construction of race, right? Because I think absolutely the notion of race is prejudice plus power, but the history of race in and of itself is not only interesting, but also informative to how we deconstruct this thing, right? When and how do white people think about themselves as white? When and how do black people think about themselves as black? 2 great texts on that. One is Exchanging Our Country Marks by Michael Gomez, and another is White Over Black by Winford Jordan. The first, Michael Gomez, in this text, Exchanging Our Country Marks, he's talking about how black folks begin to think about themselves as black people. And initially, right, they don't think of themselves as black. Right, they think of themselves as all the various kinds of people that they were. Right, and it is then later, after arriving on American shores, not just being stripped of their language and their own kind of cultural memory, but actually understanding that it was beneficial for themselves to think of themselves as black and as one homogenous group, as opposed to all these varied people, right? Because ultimately, that is when we buy into systems of power. So then another part of this conversation that we ought to have is when and how those perhaps who are in a position of power, we talk about the deconstruction of racism, when and how how do we create or recreate beloved community in a way in which that is also beneficial to them, right? Because the only way to get folk to buy in whole scale, large scale, is for it to also be still beneficial. Okay, right? You're asking me to give up, and that's why the return back to Zacchaeus, that's why the return back to the young rich ruler, why they gave up what they gave up. Because ultimately they thought and they believed that following Jesus was more beneficial to them than to hold on to their stuff. I think that's all I can say for that.
I don't know, we're going to have a lot of time for conversation, but
It's 11:40.
yeah. Would it be okay just to make a quick response? I mean, part of it is, having 2 hours to try to lay out what is a pretty wide-ranging theory leaves shortcomings. But just like one thing, if I didn't explain it adequately, your example of people asking you if you played football. What I was trying to describe between the difference between instances of scapegoating that we usually think of with a group of people ganging up on one person, a collective violence in that sense, an actual instance. That, for me, that would not be an example of scapegoating. It would be an example of the scapegoat mechanism leading a white person to put you in a box. Because the white dominant culture has constructed, the culture in a way which, the scapegoat mechanism is operating as a collective violence through the systemic part of it. For 500 years, white people have been constructing culture along a logic of us and them in a certain way. For me, what you said about the last 400 or 500 years of a construct of race, that is very meaningful to me in terms of mimetic theory, because I see mimetic theory as a general anthropological picture that shows that happening all through human history. The Romans had their way of constructing Rome, barbarian. Jews had their way of Jew, Gentile. Of constructing an identity and a dominant identity in their culture, which is over against someone else. Usually along lines of superior, inferior. My culture is superior. I see myself, this is how I see myself as good, and this other person is bad. And I see our more recent history of 400 or 500 years, especially in this country, as white people getting to construct the scapegoat mechanism culture in a way that white people are superior and people of color are inferior, and put you in a box. So for a white person to come up and say, "Oh, did you play football?" That's part of the collective violence of the scapegoat mechanism. Does that make sense?
And then my question becomes, if I'm the one in the box.
Yeah.
Then my question becomes, if I'm the one in the box, okay, awesome, explains why I'm in the box. How do I get out? How do we destroy the box? And how do we keep anybody else from building boxes? And so where I am not struggling a little bit, it's almost the opposite of struggling. It's like, okay, you, mimetic theory, liberation theology. Isn't the question, what is the overlap? I mean, how do we actually get an action plan to be able to do the work together, regardless of what the internal narrative is that is compelling us for that? I'm not going to argue for or against mimetic theory, but what I do want to say is, and I think it was a call of this conference, and how does that sit with the beloved community? How do we tackle the three evils? And I want to change, this is the conflict manager, I want to change the framing of poverty, racism, and militarism. I want to change the framing of poverty, because that is then identifying the affected and making the victims responsible for coming up out of it. It is not poverty. It is the hegemonic, absolute domination and control of value and capital. All right? So if we talk about, and I think there was another slide where you talked about materialism, but if it is taking, stealing, owning, creating, and arrogating all this stuff to myself, creating racism, so it's very easy to see who's supposed to be touching the stuff and who isn't supposed to be touching the stuff, and then creating militarism, which is either post-slavery policing all the way to world domination, of using state-sanctioned force to enforce those distinctions about who gets to hold stuff. Now, if that's what Dr. King was talking about, and that's what we're still living in, the question for all of us in this room is, what do we take our theologies, our frames, our mythologies, our theories, how do we go do that?
Just very quickly, one of the criticisms I put up there, which is my own, of mimetic theory, and it's one that I think Renee was very forthcoming in recognizing, is that he saw himself more on the prognosis side and leaving it to others to figure out what to do about it. But then, when he analyzed, say, militarism and war in his last book, for me, he left out the key to getting to the treatment thing, which is Gandhi giving us a different way to war, to fight, to resist, with that also was developed much further even than in the civil rights movement with King. I mean, it's King and Gandhi are giving us the way out.
Let's give others a chance.
Yep.
I'm sorry, Paul. I
Yep.
think it is important. We only have 10 minutes, but I have been challenged by much of what you've said in terms of a response to mimetic theory, and that's what we've invited you to do, so thank you for that. I'd like to take just a moment. This is not a partially contemplative person. Give the people that have to think a moment to think. And let's, particularly because we only have 10 minutes, if we have questions, let's start with those. Do we have questions that are burning in our hearts?
Yes, Phyllis and Joseph, thank you so much for joining Paul in figuring out the terrain of these issues. So Phyllis, I'm concerned about what you said about poverty. You're flipping the script here, you're shifting the paradigm, so that in a way that makes me think that Poor People's Campaign is just another way of systemically marginalizing the people that we actually need to be centering. So would you agree that a Poor People's Campaign is actually not what's called what it needs to be this shifted wealth distribution?
Oh, I don't mean to say that I am a huge fan of Reverend Barber's work and methodology, and I think that he has come up with a brilliant way to help folks have a reimagination, a hook for revitalized 21st century imagination around these issues and to move towards them. And so in no way do I want to deflect any power from that. At the same time, yes, I am saying, let's stop talking about poor people and poverty, and let's start talking about power, unearned and unwarranted and inequitable arrogation of resources and the way we hold on to those. Because if we are not fighting about a tax increase to make sure that schools are fully funded, and if folk who are holding on to that will, as I say, the nonviolent thing is, don't make me ask for it. If people just walked up and said, here, you know what, I need to pay 4 times the taxes I'm paying on my McMansion, there will be enough money for our local school's chief to be able to do that which he needs to do. It is not that he didn't fight hard enough, the teachers aren't teaching well enough, the parents aren't taking care of their kids well enough. There's not enough money in the coffers the way the coffers are structured now. And instead of me fussing and fighting and making somebody change that, I think what I've learned sitting here is the true nonviolent thing is those that have the rich young ruler, Zacchaeus, The folk who got it, the Koch brothers, everybody who got it, they're responsible for nonviolent action. Give it up, make it available.
Thank you.
I recently heard, I think it's Megan Kelly, say that Santa Claus was white. But really piqued my attention. She said, and Jesus was white. And so I've recently had, and so for years, I'd go along with the, retort, well, it really doesn't matter what color he is. But I was challenged by a young man in my community. He'd been challenging me for some while, and I'd use that same retort, And so what he said, well, yeah, it didn't matter until, he was colored. So my question is, and I'm beginning to see that supremacy, that white supremacy in our traditional theology. And I'm thinking that has had a profound effect on even our young people, even coming into like our Christian tradition, because I get a lot of pushback from younger people. I wonder if anybody could speak on that.
Absolutely. By all means, it's had an enormous effect on who we are and how we think of ourselves. I want to return back to that definition that was given that speaks to the acceptance of inferior social roles. And, if we identify our God, the one whom we serve, the one that we're supposed to, right, give up our own innate desires and take on his or her desires, right? And if my God looks like the one that tells me, even though I'm 50 years old, whatever, you're still a boy. If my God tells me you are designed to serve and to do no more, not to lead by any means, you are designed to, entertain, play football, maybe basketball, tap dance, sing, right? If my God tells me that, well, then when the folk who look like my God tell me to do that same thing, I have absolutely no problem with doing that, right? Because it is as if my God is saying that. Think about the article that I read just about a month ago. This young lady, it was really more like a blog rather than an article. A young lady from southern Texas, Mexican-American, and she goes through this history of her church, where her church is in this little town, and there's a picture of white Jesus at the front of the church, right? And the reason why it was white Jesus at the front of the church is because the church was donated by a larger white Baptist church. She's a Baptist woman. And white Jesus is there, right? But this is a congregation full of immigrants, both legal and illegal. And they work at this little plant where they are subject to all kind of inhumane treatment. Well, in any case, she talks about through this article that there were times in which they would be there and they would be at the altar and they would be praying to white Jesus, right? And then the immigration officers would come and raid the church and would break up families. And ultimately, by the end of this article, the lady, she concludes, the reason why brown in this case, or black people can't pray to a white Jesus, it's because white Jesus does not care about my problems. Because white Jesus don't have the same problems that I have. Which is why James Cone writes that God was black, as he mimics even the words of Bishop Henry McNaught Turner of the 19th century, right? Because we identify with those who have the same issues and the same problems. And yes, so part of what needs to happen theologically, as we have to continue to listen to those voices like a Cone or a J. Otis Roberts or whomever that are deconstructing the notions of race even within theology.
Well, this is very unfortunate, but it is 12 o'clock, and I think we have to go to lunch. I'm looking at you, Susan, to see if that's true.
I think let's take another question.
Okay, one more question then.
One of the things as a white Gerardian that I'm noticing in these conversations, especially on Facebook, is a real sense of fear from a white perspective. That in mimetic theory, there's this idea that the scapegoaters will become the scapegoat. And so there's this fear that if white people give up our power, then we are going to become the scapegoats. The tables will turn. And I always resist this idea because I don't see it happening, right? I don't see any black people rising up and saying, oh, we're out for revenge. But that's one of the big things that I'm seeing in these kinds of conversations in mimetic theory is like the tables are going to turn. And I don't know how to deal with that fear within my white fellow Gerardians. Because it's kind of the structure, it's the myth that we've been telling ourselves that I need help dealing with.
So I think very quickly, this is where my conflict management comes in. First of all, feelings are real. When people tell you what they're feeling, they're giving you a great gift of truth, and you have to lean into that. So that fear is there. And fear that is unaddressed can be extremely dangerous. So you need to go in and interrogate that and sit with it and say, why do you feel that way? And what happens? And maybe this is one of those times where, from the crossroad methodology that I thought was also kind of brilliant, there are times when in-groups do need to caucus with each other. Because some hard conversations need to happen in places that feel psychically safe to go all the way. Professor Tribble and I show up and ask your friends, what's the problem? Shut down. This is not going to happen, and that is just real. That is why when I teach conflict management, I say this is we work, get yourself a team, and the team has to be diverse. Because sometimes I got to send Paul in, not Joe, right? Okay? So that's where it starts, and it's a much longer answer than that. But where it starts is, that's real, that's legitimate, and if it is not worked through, nothing gets fixed. So you don't get to close the Facebook page on that. You're going to have to engage it.
All right, well, thank you so much.
Crossroads training always has a person of color and a white person.
I participated in it, yes.
Okay.
I just want to thank all of you.
Yes.
That was
Wow.
really
Wow.
heavy and focused and so thoughtful.